I'll look back at our previous conversations to understand the structure you're mentioning. While the world watched in horror as battles raged to decide the fate of humanity, colossi of steel and fire dominated the oceans with such absolute destructive power that a single shot from their main cannons could vaporize an entire building. And what you're about to discover about these floating fortresses will completely change everything you thought you knew about who really controlled the seas during World War II. We are talking about war machines that weighed over 70,000 tons, carried cannons capable of firing projectiles weighing 1.5 tons at distances of 40 kilometers, and required crews of over 2,000 men just to keep them running. These ships were not just weapons. They were declarations of national power, symbols of military dominance that cost the equivalent of billions of dollars today to build and took years to complete. When one of these monsters appeared on the horizon, entire fleets retreated and military strategies had to be completely rewritten. The Japanese Yamato was simply the deadliest thing ever put in the water up to that point in history. Launched in 1940, this battleship broke every imaginable record. Its 460mm main guns were the largest ever installed on any warship, capable of firing 1,460-kilogram projectiles at a distance of 42 kilometers. Its armor was so thick in some places that it reached 410 millimeters of solid steel, enough to withstand virtually anything the Allies could throw at it. Japan built the Yamato in absolute secrecy, surrounded by giant curtains so that satellites and reconnaissance aircraft could not photograph it. And when it was finally revealed, American admirals simply couldn't believe that something of that size could exist. But here's the secret few know. The Yamato never fulfilled its true potential. Japan built it to dominate line battles, those classic confrontations where warships clash in formation exchanging barrages of heavy artillery. The problem is that World War II proved that the era of battleships was over before it even began. Aircraft carriers were the future, and the Yamato spent most of the war tucked away in safe harbors because Japan simply couldn't risk losing its ultimate symbol of naval power. When it was finally sent on its last suicide mission in April 1945 to attack the American fleet off Okinawa, it didn't even come close to its target. 400 American planes met it halfway and sank it under a storm of torpedoes and bombs. Nearly 3,000 men died when the largest battleship ever built capsized and exploded, sending a plume of smoke visible for miles around. On the American side, the Iowa class represented a completely different philosophy. The USS Iowa, USS New Jersey, USS Missouri, and USS Wisconsin were smaller than the Yamato, but much faster. They could reach 33 knots, an absurd speed for ships of that size, which made them capable of choosing when to fight and when to retreat. Their 9 406mm guns could fire 1,225-kilogram projectiles with deadly accuracy. But the true genius of the Iowa class lay in its balanced design, combining firepower, protection, speed, and range in a way that no other battleship could match. The USS Missouri would go down in history as the ship where Japan signed its unconditional surrender on September 2, 1945. That ceremony in Tokyo Bay was not chosen at random. It was a clear message about who had won the war in the Pacific. While the Yamato lay at the bottom of the ocean, the Missouri was anchored in the heart of the defeated Japanese Empire. Its gun turrets symbolically pointed towards Tokyo, but it wasn't all about battleships. Aircraft carriers had become the true queens of the ocean, and the USS Enterprise was simply legendary. Nicknamed Big E, this aircraft carrier participated in virtually every major naval battle in the Pacific. It was at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked, but luckily it was at sea on that fateful Sunday. It fought at Midway, in the Solomons, in the Philippines, at Iwo Jima, and on Okinawa. It was hit, bombed, torpedoed, and lost by the Japanese at least 3 different times, but always returned to the fight. Its planes sank 71 enemy ships and shot down 911 aircraft. No other ship in the history of the American Navy has accumulated so many battle decorations. What made the Enterprise so deadly was its ability to project power hundreds of kilometers away. While battleships needed to be less than 40 kilometers away to open fire, Enterprise aircraft could attack targets 300 kilometers or more away. It was a complete revolution in naval warfare. You no longer needed to see the enemy to destroy it. You didn't need to put your ship at direct risk to inflict devastating damage. The Battle of Midway proved this definitively when carrier-based aircraft sank 4 Japanese carriers without the American and Japanese ships ever being within visual range of each other. The Germans approached naval power in a completely different way. They knew they couldn't compete numerically with the British Royal Navy, so they built ships specifically designed to terrorize Allied trade routes. The Bismarck was the jewel of the German Kriegsmarine, a fast and deadly battleship armed with 8 380mm guns. In May 1941, the Bismarck set sail on its first and last operational mission, hunting convoys in the North Atlantic. In its first engagement, it sank the battlecruiser HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, with a single devastating salvo that detonated the British ship's ammunition magazines. Of the Hood's 1,418 crew members, only 3 survived. Churchill was furious and ordered all available resources to be mobilized to sink the Bismarck. What followed was one of the greatest naval manhunts in history. The entire British home fleet was mobilized. Over 100 ships scoured the Atlantic. The Bismarck was racing towards France, to the safe harbor of Brest, but a lucky torpedo launched by an antiquated swordfish biplane struck its rudder, rendering it unable to maneuver. The British warships HMS Rodney and HMS King George V caught up with it and hammered it with hundreds of projectiles until nothing remained but a twisted mass of burning metal. But even then, the Bismarck wouldn't sink. Its armor was so strong that it absorbed a punishment that would have vaporized any other ship. In the end, its own crew opened the bottom valves and deliberately scuttled it to avoid capture. The British battleships of the King George V class formed the backbone of the Royal Navy during the war. M's Prince of Wales met a tragic fate when it was sunk by Japanese aircraft off Malaya in December 1941, along with the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. It was a brutal shock for the British, who discovered in the worst possible way that their proud warships were vulnerable to coordinated air attacks. 840 men died when the Prince of Wales fell, including Admiral Tom Phillips, who refused to abandon ship. In the Mediterranean, the battle for naval supremacy was equally fierce. The Italians possessed a modern fleet of fast battleships, but were consistently outmatched by the Royal Navy in night engagements where radar and superior training made all the difference. In the Battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941, the British used radar to detect and annihilate an Italian force sailing completely blind in the darkness. 3 Italian heavy cruisers were sunk in a matter of minutes, targets illuminated by searchlights and torn apart at point-blank range. What all these ships had in common was that they represented the pinnacle of naval engineering for their respective nations, but they also marked the end of an era. World War II conclusively proved that the future of naval power lay in aircraft carriers, submarines, and eventually missiles, not in floating steel fortresses and gigantic cannons. Battleships were magnificent, terrifying, and obsolete at the same time. After the war, virtually all were decommissioned or scrapped. The American Iowa class battleships had a second life during the Korean War and even in the Persian Gulf in the 1980s. But they were relics of a bygone era, firing their cannons at land targets because there were no more enemy ships worthy of engaging them. The legacy of these giants of the sea remains in the stories of courage and sacrifice of their crews, in the technological advancements they propelled, and in the strategic lessons they taught about naval power and how it should be employed. Each of these ships carried thousands of human lives, represented years of industrial labor, and embodied the hopes and fears of entire nations struggling for survival. When they sank, it wasn't just machines being destroyed. It was entire communities of men being sent to the bottom of the ocean, each ship a floating city with its own hierarchies, traditions, and histories that disappeared forever into the dark depths. Destroyers also deserve recognition because they were the true workhorses of the fleets. Smaller and more agile ships that did everything from escorting convoys to hunting submarines and launching torpedo attacks against targets much larger than themselves. The USS Johnston is the perfect example of suicidal courage in naval combat. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Commander Ernest Evans saw an overwhelming force of Japanese battleships and cruisers advancing to massacre the vulnerable American escort carriers. The Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer armed with 127 mm guns, facing battleships with 460 mm guns. It was like a child with a slingshot attacking tanks. Evans didn't hesitate for a second. He ordered full speed and attacked alone, firing smoke screens to cover the aircraft carriers while launching all his torpedoes at the battleship Yamato. The Japanese were so surprised by the audacity of the attack that they diverted their entire formation to avoid the torpedoes, completely breaking their offensive momentum. The Johnston then began dueling with heavy cruisers, its small guns spitting projectiles in a frenetic cadence while receiving salvo after salvo of heavy artillery. One after another, its turrets were destroyed. Its deck was transformed into a hell of twisted metal and flames. But Evans continued fighting until literally nothing functional remained on the ship. When the Johnston finally sank, the Japanese captains who passed by its survivors in the water saluted in respect for the desperate courage they had witnessed. Submarines formed an entirely different dimension of naval warfare, operating in the shadows, hunting silently, killing without warning. German U-boats nearly strangled Britain by cutting its supply lines across the Atlantic. At the height of the submarine campaign in 1942, the Germans were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than shipyards could replace them. Sea wolves operating in coordinated packs, attacking convoys at night on the surface where they were fast and difficult to detect, diving during the day to escape hunters. Admiral Karl Dönitz perfected these tactics and came close to winning the Battle of the Atlantic single-handedly. But the Allies developed countermeasures. Airborne radar that could detect submarines on the surface even in total darkness. Improved sonar that located submerged U-boats. More lethal depth charges. And the breaking of Enigma codes, which allowed the Allies to redirect convoys away from concentrations of U-boats. The tide turned in May 1943 when the Germans lost 41 submarines in a single month, losses so catastrophic that Dönitz temporarily withdrew his wolves from the Atlantic. Of the 39,000 men who served on U-boats during the war, 28,000 never returned, a mortality rate of 72%, the highest of any German military branch. In the Pacific, American submarines conducted an equally devastating strangulation campaign against Japan. The difference was that the Japanese never developed effective anti-submarine tactics and treated the protection of merchant convoys as a secondary task unworthy of true warships. It was a fatal strategic error. American submarines operating from bases at Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, and Brisbane systematically destroyed the Japanese merchant navy, cutting off the flow of oil, rubber, ore, and food that kept the Japanese war machine running. By the end of the war, Japanese ships could virtually no longer move without being torpedoed. The USS Wahoo, under the command of the legendary Dudley Morton, became the terror of the Japanese seas, sinking 20 ships in its first 5 patrols. Morton developed aggressive tactics that went against all conventional submarine doctrine, attacking on the surface whenever possible, using the deck gun to conserve torpedoes, and pursuing targets into shallow waters where submarines would normally never dare to enter. On its sixth patrol in the Sea of Japan in October 1943, the Wahoo disappeared after sinking 4 more ships. Decades later, it was discovered that it had been sunk by Japanese aircraft while attempting to escape through the La Perouse Strait. Morton and his entire crew of 80 men died, but his philosophy of relentless attack was adopted by the entire American submarine force. Cruisers occupied the middle ground between the firepower of battleships and the agility of destroyers. The USS Indianapolis is remembered not for its victories but for its ultimate tragedy. After delivering components of the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima, the Indianapolis was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine in the last month of the war. The ship sank in just 12 minutes, too quickly to send an adequate distress signal. 900 men entered the water. 4 days passed before anyone realized the ship was missing. When they were finally rescued, only 316 men were still alive. The others had died from exposure, dehydration, and most horrifically, shark attacks that fed on the defenseless survivors floating in the open ocean. It was the worst naval disaster in American history and a brutal reminder that the sea killed indiscriminately between winners and losers. Technology advanced at a frenetic pace during the war, driven by the desperate need to gain any advantage over the enemy. Radar completely revolutionized naval combat, allowing the detection and engagement of targets that could not even be seen with the naked eye. During the night battle of Savo Island in August 1942, Japanese cruisers without radar completely destroyed an American force that also lacked radar, relying only on superior optics and intensive night combat training. But a year later, in subsequent battles, American ships equipped with radar massacred Japanese forces sailing blindly in the darkness. The fire control system also evolved dramatically. At the beginning of the war, firing a naval gun at a moving target 20 kilometers away was more art than science, involving complex calculations of speed, direction, wind, curvature of the earth, and a dozen other variables. Analog mechanical computers began to automate these calculations, dramatically increasing accuracy. By the end of the war, an American cruiser could consistently hit targets on the first or second salvo, something that would have been unthinkable in 1939. Anti-aircraft defense also underwent a forced revolution. At the beginning of the war, ships relied on manually operated cannons that simply couldn't keep up with fast-moving aircraft performing evasive maneuvers. The losses were terrible. Then came rapid-fire anti-aircraft guns like the 40mm Bofors and the 20mm Oerlikon, capable of firing hundreds of projectiles per minute, creating a metal wall through which attacking aircraft had to fly. And at the end of the war, the Americans developed VT proximity fuses that exploded automatically when they passed near an aircraft, no longer needing direct impact. This technology alone increased the effectiveness of anti-aircraft artillery fivefold. But even with all these advances, the human element remained central. It was men who made the decisions, who kept the machines running in impossible conditions, who fought fires and floods when their ships were hit, who remained at their posts even when death was certain. The engine rooms at the bottom of the ships were furnaces where men worked half-naked in temperatures exceeding 50 degrees, keeping the boilers fueled and the turbines spinning. When a torpedo hit, these rooms were often the first to flood, trapping their crews with no chance of escape. Anti-aircraft gunners faced kamikaze attacks knowing that if they failed, planes laden with explosives would crash into their positions. During the Battle of Okinawa, more than 1,900 kamikazes attacked the American fleet in relentless waves, sinking 36 ships and damaging 368 others. The gunners remained at their posts firing until the barrels of their guns melted from the heat. until kamikaze projectiles obliterated them along with their weapons, because ceasing to fire meant certain death for the entire ship. And when ships sank, sailors faced impossible decisions: to stay and try to save the ship or abandon it while there was still time; to close watertight doors knowing that men were still trapped on the other side, but it was necessary to save the rest of the crew; to remain at the post transmitting distress signals while the ship sank beneath you. These were the silent horrors of naval warfare that rarely appear in official records but haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. These warships were not merely machines of destruction. They were microcosms of the nations that built them, reflecting their military philosophies, their industrial capabilities, and their determination to win at any cost. The Yamato represented Japanese pride and its belief that quality could overcome quantity, a gamble that ultimately cost an empire. The American Iowa class demonstrated the overwhelming industrial capacity of the United States to produce not only powerful ships, but entire fleets of them supported by thousands of auxiliary vessels. The German Bismarck embodied the doctrine of commercial warfare that nearly broke Great Britain, but failed because Germany never managed to build submarines and surface ships in sufficient numbers to truly dominate the Atlantic. In the end, World War II at sea was won not by the most powerful ships, but by the navies that best understood how to integrate different types of ships into coherent strategies, that mastered the logistics necessary to keep fleets operating thousands of miles from home, that trained their crews to the point of excellence, and that, crucially, possessed the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. The Japanese had magnificent ships but lacked the oil to power them or trained pilots to fly their aircraft carriers after the veterans died. The Germans built deadly U-boats but failed to protect their own supply lines when the tide turned against them. And so the colossi that dominated the oceans for 6 bloody years were all relegated to history, some sunk in battle, others dismantled in shipyards, a few preserved as floating memorials to remind future generations of the terrible price of war, and the courage of those who sailed into combat knowing they might never return. Their stories remain as a testament to human ingenuity, the brutality of modern industrial warfare, and the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of sailors who fought and died in distant seas far from home. If you've made it this far, it's because you're truly interested in military history and the events that shape the world we live in today. This channel is dedicated to bringing you the most fascinating, disturbing, and forgotten stories of naval warfare told with the depth and respect they deserve. Every week we publish new videos exploring naval battles, secret technologies, maritime disasters, and the mysteries that remain unanswered in the depths of the oceans. Subscribe to the channel now and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any episodes, because the next stories we're going to tell are even more incredible than this one. Leave a comment telling us which warship or naval battle you'd like to see in the next video. And if you enjoyed this content, leave a like so more people can discover these extraordinary stories. Until next time,